Hello everybody, reading again from Psychological Types by Carl Jung, and we're going to be looking at the definition of abstraction today. We looked at concretism last time, so it makes sense, doesn't it? Okay, abstraction, as the word already implies, is the drawing out or isolation of a content, for example, a meaning or general character, etc., from a connection containing other elements whose combination as a totality is something unique or individual and therefore inaccessible to comparison. Singularity, uniqueness, and incomparability are obstacles to cognition, since, to the cognitive tendency, the remaining elements, though felt to be essentially bound up with the content, must appear irrelevant. Abstraction, therefore, is that form of mental activity which releases the essential content or fact from its connection with irrelevant elements. It distinguishes it from them, or, in other words, differentiates it. In its wider sense, everything is abstract that is separated from its connection with non-appertaining elements. Abstraction, then, is a mental activity which isolates part of an object or ideas around it and considers it as a differentiated thing, like a differentiated part, as opposed to the whole object. So if you were looking at, as a really basic example, if you were looking at a painting, for example, you'd look at the whole painting, but then you would abstract via the process of thinking, feeling, sensing, or intuiting. You would use one of those processes in an abstracting way. So not only do you have the 4 cognitive functions, you also have the introverted and extroverted attitudes of those, but then you also can have those functions happen in an abstracting way or a concrete way. The more you think, the more abstract it becomes if you're abstracting. But then you might switch directions and concretize, I'm guessing, until you find your way of understanding something. Abstraction is an activity belonging to psychological functions in general. There is a thinking which abstracts, just as there is abstracting feeling, sensation, and intuition. Abstracting thinking brings into relief a content that is distinguished from other irrelevant elements by its intellectual and logical qualities. Abstracting feeling does the same with a content characterized by feeling, similarly with sensation and intuition. Hence, not only are there abstract thoughts, but also abstract feelings, which latter are defined by Sully as intellectual, aesthetic, and moral. Narlowski adds the religious feeling to these. Abstract feelings would, in my view, correspond with the higher or ideal feelings of Narlowski. I put abstract feelings on the same line as abstract thoughts. Abstract sensation would be aesthetic as distinguished from sensual sensation, and abstract intuition would be symbolic as opposed to fantastical intuition. Okay, so let's go back again and have a look at some of these, break down some of these definitions here. So if you remember when we read over sensation, he made the distinction between sensual sensation, which I think, although it sounds kind of sexy, it's literally that you are sensing an object with the 5 senses, or internally, so you're sensing sensations within the body. And then the aesthetic sensation would be the abstract sensation. So he used the example of looking at a flower is sensation, it's sensual sensation, and then honing in on the most beautiful part of the flower is aesthetic. And then abstract intuition would be symbolical as opposed to fantastical intuition. So fantastical intuition is contents breaking out of the subconscious and making themselves conscious, but abstract intuition would deal with the symbols. And then he's saying that abstract feeling and thinking is to do with intellectual or logical qualities. So I guess pondering on something, making judgments about it, if-then statements, stuff like that. In this work, the concept of abstraction is linked up with the idea of the psychoenergetic process involved in it. When I assume an abstracting attitude towards an object, I do not let the object affect me in its totality, but I distinguish a portion of it from its connections, at the same time excluding the irrelevant parts. My purpose is to rid myself of the object as a single and unique whole, and to extract only a portion of it. Awareness of the whole undoubtedly takes place, but I do not plunge myself into this awareness. My interest does not flow out into the totality, but withdraws itself from the object as a whole, bringing the abstracted portion into myself, i.e. into my conceptual world, which is already prepared or constellated for the purpose of abstracting a part of the object. It is only by virtue of a subjective constellation of concepts that I possess the power of abstracting from the object. Interest I conceive as that energy libido, which I bestow upon the object as value, or which the object draws from me, even maybe against my will or unbeknown to myself. I visualize the abstracting process, therefore, as a withdrawal of libido from the object, or as a backflow of value from the object to a subjective abstract content. Thus, for me, abstraction has the meaning of an energetic depreciation of the object. In other words, abstraction can be expressed as an introverting libido movement. I call an attitude abstracting when it is both introverting and at the same time assimilates to already prepared abstract contents in the subject a certain essential portion of the object. I think he's saying here, abstracting necessarily has to be introverted because your libido, your psychic energy, or maybe your attention, if you want to call it that, is taking something, a slice of the object, bringing it in, and it's intermingling with things that are already in there. So by necessity, that has to be an introverted process. So conversely, say if I did that and then I thought, that's a little bit too abstract to understand, that's hard to understand, I need to attach it to something that I already know, then my libido would turn outwards again, and it would apply that new abstract or modified abstract idea that I came upon whilst I was introverting and abstracting, and it would place it back into the real world. So I might give an example of a time where that applied, or I might attach it to a new object to give it some concrete form in order for me to understand it, or in order for me to explain it to somebody. I do that here in these videos. So I'll read something, I will take a portion of that for whatever reason I've fixated on that idea, because perhaps I already have ideas in my head about what that could mean. I'll introvert, so I've abstracted via an introverted process. It will commingle with things that are already in there, and then I'll go, okay, so an example of that might be when you do this. So I'm concretizing there, and I'm also extroverting, because I'm explaining it in a way where I've fed it back into an object, but not necessarily the same one that the idea originally came from. This is so hard to explain. The more abstract a content, the more unrepresentable it is. I adhere to Kant's view, which maintains that a concept is the more abstract, the more it exudes the differences of things, in the sense that abstraction at its highest level is absolutely removed from the object, thereby attaining the extreme limit of unrepresentability. It is this abstraction which I term the idea. Conversely, an abstraction that still possesses representability or obviousness is a concrete concept. An example I can think of is, alright, I'll use an MBTI argument that I was thinking about today. So a lot of people go around obviously saying, if you have these attributes, you are probably a certain type. But I was thinking that's almost like looking at personality type as a syndrome, because you're looking at certain characteristics and you're saying, yeah, you have most of those, so therefore you're this. And that's kind of like a syndrome because it's a set of, well, symptoms, but it's a set of characteristics or behaviors. And what people don't take into account is when you're typing, you're not diagnosing a syndrome. So to say, well, you have these attributes, so you're probably this, actually doesn't prove what cognitive functions people are using, because you're not saying, oh, you're using this cognitive function, therefore you're this. That would be typing someone, okay? But all we really do is look at the finished product and assume to know which cognitive functions were used to result in that finished product, when actually you can kind of take a very educated guess, but it actually doesn't provide proof because it's lacking in really basic abstract thinking, which would be along the lines of, if ducks are always yellow, then everything that is yellow is always a duck. That's not true. I find it really hard to think of things like this. If you just take that very abstract concept, okay, and you can even take duck and yellow out of it, and you could say, if A then B, then B always equals A. And that is not a true statement. That's not logically sound, okay? That's completely abstract. So if we add a little bit more concretism to it, and we add the words duck and yellow, so if all ducks are yellow, so that means that all yellow things are ducks, we can kind of see there, well, that's not true because the sun's yellow and that's not a duck, okay? So that's making that abstract logical sentence, if you will, into a little bit more of a concrete sentence. And then you apply that back to what I was just saying about MBTI. So it's almost like saying, well, it would be the same concept. Anybody who has this cognitive function stack will act like this. So that must mean that anybody who acts like this must have this cognitive function stack. And then there we can see that that's because that's very concrete, you kind of lose the logic a little bit. It's kind of not abstract enough. But then when you remove some of the concreteness and you put it into the ducks as yellow sentence, then you can start to see that there's a flaw there. There's like a logical error, and then you abstract it right back to just A and B rather than duck and yellow, and then it's kind of like it's completely abstract, so it's perhaps harder to understand, but that would depend on obviously what type of thinker you are. If you're an abstract thinker, you would immediately recognize that that sentence was false. If you're more of a concrete thinker, you might prefer some of the other ones and understand them that way. But what I'm trying to say is when you have a concept like MBTI and you're trying to prove something, you can kind of get near the mark. You can use these markers to bring you closer, but then it would be helpful to check if it stood up to an abstract logical interpretation. So take the concreteness away from it. And then if it's not a true sentence, then you actually haven't proved anything. You're still only signposting towards something. Now my brain's hurting. Thank you for listening.